I know the total gap across a multiple of 10. So when we're thinking about mental subtraction, we need to start training our brain to think about gaps. And this is really, really important because subtraction is actually all about the gaps between two numbers. For example, 72 and 80. What would be the gap between those two numbers? Remember our jigsaw numbers? What's the jigsaw of 2? That's right, it's 8. And the gap between 72 and 80 is 8. Another important gap to think about is the gaps that come after a multiple of 10. So for example, the gap between, say, 80 and 84 would be 4. Now, what if we put those two problems together? We started with the number 72, we then had 80, and then we had 84. What if we wanted to find the total gap across a multiple of 10? Well, our first gap here is between 72 and 80, and that's when we use our jigsaw numbers. The jigsaw of 2 is 8. So the gap between 72 and 80 is 8. The gap between 80 and 84 we know by counting on, and that is 4. So our total gap between 72 and 84 is 12, because 8 plus 4 equals 12. We could write that find the gap problem as a subtraction equation. 84 subtract 72 equals 12. We could also write it as a column subtraction. 84 subtract 72. And solving it this way, we'd need to use our columns. So we would start with the ones or the units column. 4 subtract 2 equals 2. And then we'd move to the tens column. 8 subtract 7 equals 1. 84 subtract 72 equals 12. But I think it's easier to look for the gaps, to train our brains to think of the gaps and solve a question like that in our brains, especially when we have to use borrowing. So here's another question. 75 subtract 67. Now, if we were to solve this using a column subtraction, we are going to have to borrow. 75 subtract 67. And the reason we need to borrow is because our 5 here is smaller than our 7. We can't do 5 take away 7. That's impossible. So we have to borrow something to make that 5 bigger. And we do that by borrowing from the tens column. So cross out the 7 and make that 10 less, because that 7 is actually 70, isn't it? So instead of it being 70, it's now 60. So we show that by putting a 6. We can put the 10 that we borrowed over here to make 15. 15 take away 7 is 8. And in this case here, 6 take away 6 is 0, and we don't need to write the 0 down there, so we can see our final answer is 8. But if we're training our brain to think in gaps, we don't need to do those columns, and we don't need to do that borrowing. We can simply just think of the gaps between numbers and multiples of 10. So I'm going to start with 67, and then my brain is going to think of what the gap is up to 75. Because I've trained my brain really hard in multiples of 10, I know that the next multiple of 10 after 67 is 70. And I know that the gap here is 3. Going back to our jigsaws, the jigsaw of 7 is 3 because 7 plus 3 equals 10, and that takes us to our multiple of 10. I know that the gap between 70 and 75 is 5. And so I can see really quickly, or I can think really quickly, that the total gap between 67 and 75 is 3 plus 5, which equals 8. And once I train my brain to think in that way, finding the gap is a whole lot quicker than it is writing down on a piece of paper in a column form and having to borrow numbers. So this is our first step in training our brain to think of subtraction as finding gaps, by finding gaps across a multiple of 10. So remember, when you're looking at a subtraction question, what you're really trying to do is to find out what the gap is.